All right, so we're going to be going over chapters 1 through 3 in today's lecture. This is going to be centered around exercise physiology. Chapter 1 is going to go over our muscle physiology, chapter 2, our heart, and then 3 is going to be our energy systems, how our body gets energy. All right, so first off, we're going to look at the heart, and we're mainly going to be focusing on blood flow of the heart today. So the basic concept today is going to be how we take deoxygenated blood, right? Blood that we've used, we've taken the oxygen out of, it has carbon dioxide in it, and we want to reoxygenate it, right? So here we have a picture of the heart. You can see right here we have our vena cava. This is the superior, and then we have our inferior vena cava, right? So deoxygenated blood is going to come in through those veins into the right atrium. From there, it'll go into the right ventricle, which is right here below. And then from there, it'll go out the pulmonary artery where it'll be dispersed to the left and right lung, right? From there, inside the lungs, we are going to have gas exchange, right? Carbon dioxide is going to leave the deoxygenated blood, and oxygen will come into that blood, and we'll have oxygenated blood. From there, it is going to enter back into the heart, that oxygenated blood, via the left atrium. It'll go into the left ventricle, from which it can go out of the aorta and be delivered to the rest of the body, our brain, our muscles, so we can supply that with oxygen. So here's just another look at it, right? We have those superior and inferior vena cava, the right atrium, the right ventricle, that pulmonary artery where we can deliver it to the lungs. It comes back in to the left atrium, through the left ventricle where it will forcefully contract and push it throughout the body. So just something to know for our heart physiology, we need to know cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount of blood that we can pump per minute, and that is a product of heart rate and stroke volume, right? So we have our beats per minute with our heart rate, and stroke volume is the amount of blood that we pump per beat, right? So if we're exercising, right, our heart rate goes up because we need more oxygen in our muscles. So our body's going to push more blood around so we can oxygenate that tissue. Heart rate's going to go up, and thus cardiac output will go up. If we train so our cardiovascular system becomes more efficient, we are going to have a larger stroke volume so we can push more blood per beat. We are going to also have a cardiac output increase. Last two things on this slide, we're going to look at myocardial infarction. It's just a heart attack. So if you hear anyone say infarction, they're talking about a heart attack. And then lastly, ischemia. This is the lack of blood flow. So continuing on this topic of reoxygenation, we're going to look at the pulmonary system. Here we have the capillaries, and this is where that gas exchange takes place. This is in the lungs here, but it's also we have capillaries at the muscle. That's where gas exchange will happen when we have, deoxygenated blood in the muscle. In the alveoli, though, the little sacs deep inside the lung, this is where you can see right here on this photo, right? We have the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein and the capillaries in these alveoli, right? And that's where gas exchange will happen. We have the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide so we can reoxygenate that blood. So again, just looking at the same thing here, we see the capillaries in the lungs where this gas exchange can take place. Again, we have the deoxygenated blood coming in. We fill it with oxygen, take out the carbon dioxide, and we can ship it back out through the body once it's oxygenated. So last thing on our heart and our blood flow topic is the muscle pump. So we have to send blood throughout the entire body, and to get all the way down to our feet, it's far away from the heart. So when that blood goes down there and we have to bring deoxygenated blood back up to the heart so we can reoxygenate it, that's a long way away. So we have something called the muscle pump that'll help with this. So let's say we just did a really intense bout of exercise, we're feeling a little lightheaded. What we can do is we could utilize the muscle pump by contracting our skeletal muscles, right? So if I do like a calf, like a mid-air calf raise or just move my ankle around, right? I'm going to activate my lower leg muscles, which will put pressure on the vein and act as a pump to push the blood back to my heart, right? You can see in the picture here, we have the contraction of these skeletal muscles. And then as the blood travels up, we also have a mechanism where these valves inside the vein will close so there's no trickle back, right? There's no blood falling back down as we try to push it up. So it helps make it more efficient. Once the blood's in here, this little valve will close, and so on and so forth until it reaches back to the heart. All right. So moving on from chapter two's content, we're going to look more at our energy flow. So how our body gets energy and when and how do we use certain pathways to get energy. So just first off, we're going to be looking at where energy comes from, right? We have the sun. It'll go to plants where we can consume, right? This will fuel animals, and we can also consume animals. We get proteins and fats. And through our metabolic pathways, which is our energy systems, we can produce what's called ATP, right? And you can see on the other side there on this picture, we can just consume the plants, right, as food, and we can make ATP out of that. So from there, we get our basic macronutrients, carbs, fats, and proteins, all of which we can use for storage or making ATP. And just a little picture of photosynthesis here. As plants pick up light, they can create glucose, and we can consume that. So look at ATP, right? Like I mentioned earlier, we use carbs, fats, and proteins to create ATP. This is our primary energy molecule, right? Everything that happens in the body, we need ATP for. So this is called adenosine triphosphate. And we look at the structure, we have adenine, we have ribose, which creates adenosine, right? As you can see in the first word of the structure. Then we have triphosphate, which just means three phosphates. And within these phosphates, we have these higher energy bonds, which will be important later as we go over how we get energy from this. So just looking at our engine, right? We can use fat, carbs, we can use proteins. It's not as often, but we can use this phosphocreatines as well, which we'll go over to help fuel our engine. And then cars, they just run on gasoline. They combust, create energy pretty simply. We have complex mechanisms that allow us to fuel our body. So going into, we have our three metabolic pathways, right? Three different energy systems, methods that our body can use to create energy. First, we have the phosphagen system, the ATP phosphocreatine system, the anaerobic glycolytic, or just called the glycolytic system, glycolysis, you might have heard before. And then lastly, our oxidative system. You can see I have a little chart here on the right. So what differentiates these different pathways is going to be duration of activity for which we need energy, and then the intensity, right? So the longer we go, right, the longer and more low intensity we have our aerobic system. So super simple, right? Jogging, simple movements. Glycolytic is a little more intense, a little shorter duration. And our most intense one is our phosphagen system, very short duration. This is looking at the rate of energy production. So for these intensities, we need energy quick. We don't need it as quick. And this is very slow rate of energy production. So again, like I said, for our energy systems, the main thing that dictates which one we're going to be using primarily is our intensity and duration. So on the right, we have our primary systems. I'm going to start with phosphagen, right? We have extremely high intensity, and that'll only sustain that activity for 0 to 6 seconds, right? That's our phosphagen system. Quick, it can produce it at a really quick rate, but only for a short duration, right? Before we fatigue. Then as we go, we get longer in duration. We start to move into glycolysis, right? And then intensity goes down a little bit. And then as we go into lower, moderate intensities, super long activities like running, even just walking, breathing, is going to be primarily our oxidative systems. So again, we're looking at ATP. We can store a little bit of ATP, right? That's from our ATP phosphocreatine system. We can use it for a quick burst, right? Right off the bat, whenever we start any activity, we might use this ATP first. We can get it from glycolysis, which is an anaerobic system. And then we have the Krebs cycle, which is our aerobic oxidative system. So again, like I said, with those energy bonds between those phosphate groups, it's important to understand where the energy actually comes from. So it comes from when this singular phosphate group separates from ATP, splits off, breaking that energy bond, and makes ADP, and then that energy release right there, as you can see with this little pop. All right, so a little more detail on the phosphagen system, right? Our ATP phosphocreatine system. So there's going to be a source of ATP for short-term, high-intensity activities, right? For example, jumping, short sprints, right? Super high intensity, low duration. So there's going to be, like I said, active at the start of all of our activities, even if it's not super intense, because that ATP is already there and readily available. So the phosphocreatine part is another part. So we have our ATP that's already stored, and then we have phosphocreatines that we can use to make more, right? So what happens is that phosphate group in that phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate, right, CP, it's going to be broken down to replenish more ATP. And what happens is ADP, right, as we saw in this previous picture, combined with the phosphate group from that creatine phosphate, right? Lastly, we have minimal stores of this in our muscles and is going to be primarily used in type 2 fibers, which we'll go over fiber types later. So looking at how this creatine phosphate can create ATP out of ADP, right? We have this higher energy bond here, right? When it releases, we have creatine, we have a phosphate, and then we have the energy that can be used to create a bond with ADP, right? Like I said, we have those high energy bonds that we need in between each phosphate group of ATP. So we have the energy and we have the phosphate. So then we just add that into ADP, we get our ATP, and then we can release that again and have energy. Just going back to it again, just kind of emphasizing phosphocreatine system is super high intensity, short duration, and then we'll go over our glycolytic and aerobic metabolic pathways later. So looking at glycolysis, right? That's that in-between one. We're going to have moderate intensity and little bit longer duration. It's not too long, but a little bit longer here, right? So let's break down the word glycolysis. So what it means is the cutting or breakdown of glucose. So we have glyco, right? Let's talk about glucose or glycogen, right? These are sugars that we have in our body. We can consume glucose, and we could also store glucose as glycogen in our muscle, which can be used later. And then lysis, whenever you see this in other terminology, lysis just means cutting or breaking down of something. And again, like I said, it's a moderate intensity system and will be used as our activities take longer, right? Beyond 30 seconds. So right beyond that phosphagen system, right? And so what we have with the glucose, once it breaks down, we get 2-pyruvate, right? We can look at it as glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and we're splitting it into a 2 3-carbon molecules, right? So what kind of energy are we getting from glycolysis when we break down a sugar, a glucose? So when we split that 6-carbon glucose, we get the 2-pyruvate molecules, and it's going to cost us 2 ATP to do this. So it costs ATP to do it. And then when we have glycogen, like I said, that's that sugar that we already have stored in our body. Like I said, in the muscle, we can also store it in our liver. It only costs 1 ATP, right? So it's a little less costly to use it, but we don't always have it available. So when we have that pyruvate, we generate 2 ATP. So when we split that glucose up, we get 2 ATP, right? And we do it 2 times, we have 2 pyruvate. We get 4 total ATP, right? And then we subtract our cost, right? We have two ATP costs when we're using glucose, and we'll have two ATP left over. When it's glycogen, we only have that one ATP cost, and we'll have three ATP left over. So in total, from the initial step of glycolysis, just from splitting the glucose up, we have 2 to 3 ATP yield. And we still have this pyruvate left over, and we have left over NADH electron transporters, which will be called taxicabs. You'll see what they're used for later. So what happens with that pyruvate once we split our glucose, right? We have the ATP from just splitting it, but what can be done with pyruvate once we have it? So there's two pathways that glycolysis can go down, right? And it's really two different energy systems, still using glucose, right? Still glycolysis, but we have our anaerobic glycolysis and then our aerobic glycolysis. So in the presence of oxygen is aerobic, and without oxygen is anaerobic, right? Anaerobic means we don't have oxygen. So our fast glycolysis is a little bit more intensity based and shorter duration exercise. And when we have that, that pyruvate will become lactate. When we have a more aerobic based activity, longer durations, lower intensities, like jogging, we are going to have our pyruvate become acetyl-CoA and it'll move into the oxidative system, right? That one we saw at the beginning, super slow, low intensities, long durations. That is the second part of glycolysis. So again, we have our anaerobic and then our aerobic glycolysis. So looking at our fast anaerobic glycolysis, this is when our energy demand is higher, relatively higher, and we don't have sufficient oxygen presence, right? Maybe we're early on in our exercise, or we're doing something more intense that our aerobic system doesn't have time to accumulate oxygen for. We don't need oxygen, right? We can use our fast glycolysis, right? So this is where that lactate comes in play, right? Because our pyruvate, when we're having this intensity and duration, it's going to become lactate, right? And you hear a lot of times, like when you feel that soreness in your muscles or it's getting tighter, we blame it on lactate. It's a common culprit of muscle fatigue, but it's not actually what's causing that soreness. Even though it's developing as we do our activity, it's not what's causing it. What causes it is our hydrogen ion accumulation, right? So as we go through our metabolic pathways, we have byproducts of hydrogen ions, right? And that's what causes that sore fatigue feeling in our muscles because it's acidic, right? It's a pH change, and that acidosis is going to make us feel it in our muscles, right? But lactate is not the culprit. It's just there at the crime scene when the crime happened, right? You can blame it on hydrogen ions. Lactate is actually useful to us. So there's a few things that it's used for, right? It can be used in type 1 fibers, right? As an energy substrate, help fuel like our heart muscles, is lower intensity fibers. It can be oxidized and cleared in the origin or other muscles. So wherever that lactate came from, whatever muscle was using ATP using the glycolytic system, it can be oxidized and cleared there or shuttled to other muscles for the same process to happen. The other thing it can be used for is gluconeogenesis, meaning we can create new glucose out of it. So this can be transported to the liver and enter what's called a Cori cycle, which through the Cori cycle, we can create more glucose. All right, and then lastly, we can use it as a marker of a person's ability to recover, right? If we're able to clear lactate more fastly, it means our body is able to recover faster. All right, so moving on with fast glycolysis, we have something called our lactate threshold. And what this is our first influx or change in lactate accumulation, meaning at this point, at some point in our exercise, we're going to start seeing lactate build up in our blood. And what this indicates is a reliance on anaerobic mechanisms. So when we have our anaerobic glycolysis working, it is going to turn pyruvate into lactate. And this will cause this on the graph to go up in our blood. So one way you can look at it is if we take a jog, if we're going on a jog, we're going to start in our aerobic system because the intensity is not super high. The demand does not require us to feel energy very quickly. We can sustain it with our aerobic system, right? Slow, lots of energy, can go for a long time. But at some point, we are going to need more ATP than we are getting from it as exercise gets more intense or as duration goes on at a certain intensity, right? You can't hold the same intensity forever. So at some point, you're going to have to rely on your anaerobic glycolysis to help fuel your job. And when this happens, we will see this lactate increase, right? The second inflection in the graph is further along. We have our onset blood lactate accumulation. It's just another later, more specific term for lactate threshold. And this is at 4 millimoles of per liter of blood lactate. And at this point, we are going to see a reliance on anaerobic systems, the need for these quicker producing energy systems to kick in. We can leverage this occurrence by training at this point, right? We can check via an exercise test like when our blood lactate starts to increase, and we can train at that intensity. And what this will do is it'll increase our mitochondrial content, and it'll also decrease reliance on anaerobic systems because we're training at the point at which our aerobic system at which our aerobic system is at a high level of stress, and we're going to push its ability to stay in an aerobic state. Excuse me, stay in an aerobic state. And if we continue to train at this, we should see that, for example, on this, you see this dotted line. It shows trained subjects. So in trained subjects, that inflection, that increase in lactate in the blood happens later, which means as we jog, right, our oxygen uptake will slowly increase. We will slowly need more oxygen and we'll use more of our VO2 max. But in a trained individual, they can stay in an aerobic state using their aerobic system, their oxygen-based system for longer before they need to rely on their glycolytic systems. And what this means is you can just go longer because if you don't have to use your backup systems for this task, you can be able to just perform longer. And then once you hit that point, you're going to kick into your fast glycolysis system. And here's just another set of numbers. So for untrained individuals, this should occur at 50 to 60% of VO2 max, and then trained individuals, it'll happen more at like 70 or 80%. All right, so moving from fast glycolysis to slow glycolysis in our oxidative system. So again, slow glycolysis is our aerobic glycolysis. So we're going to be looking at our oxidative system now. So these are for lower energy demands, less intensity, and when we have sufficient oxygen present. Pyruvate in this situation, instead of becoming lactate, it is going to be transported into the mitochondria and it'll become acetyl-CoA and it'll go through what's called the Krebs cycle, which you can see in the photo right here. And we'll go a little more in depth on that later. Our NADH is also transported, and this will be used in another set of our oxidative systems, the electron transport chain, and it'll turn hydrogen ions into ATP. So the primary source of energy for low intensity, long duration activities, again, is our oxidative system. When we're resting, doing nothing just to keep ourselves alive, this is also the system that is responsible for the energy to keep us doing our activities. Again, we have the Krebs cycle, which uses acetyl-CoA, our electron transport chain, which uses those hydrogen ions that build up. And also, it doesn't just use glucose. In this system, we can use fat and we can oxidize fat. And it's called beta oxidation. And most of our energy at rest, when we're doing not too many things, will come from this fat oxidation. So triglycerides will become free fatty acids, which can become acetyl-CoA and hydrogen ions, which will enter into the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And th this will produce a large amount of energy. It's not as quick as using glucose, sugars, right? Carbohydrates, but it produces an immense amount of energy that is required for us to sustain our maintenance energy requirements throughout the day. And on top of that, protein can be used as well, but since protein is a structural compound, we want to be using that for repair. All right, so looking at our glucose yields of energy, right? Slow glycolysis will have 4 ATP out of substrate level phosphorylation. Out of oxidative phosphorylation, we'll get the 2 NADH, 3 ATP from each of those in the electron transport chain. And that'll give us 6 total. So it's 10 right there. Krebs cycle will have 2 rotations per glucose. So each glucose, we get to go through the Krebs cycle twice. So at a substrate level, we get 2 ATP, 24 from oxidative phosphorylation. That's our NADH, our transporters carrying those hydrogen ions. And then GTP, we get 4, which is also from FADH, which is another transporter. In total, that'll be 40. Then down at the bottom, this is what I'm talking about, that fat oxidation. So when we oxidize one 18 carbon triglyceride, which is a fat, we get a good amount of energy out of that. So right there at the bottom, you can see it's 147 ATP per fatty acid times 3 fatty acids per triglyceride molecule. We get 441 ATP. Then you also see from our glycerol, we get 22. So look at that, it's 463 ATPs total. It's a really slow system. It's not like we can just kick in and immediately start producing that amount of ATP, but over the course of a long period of time, it'll produce a large amount just off of this one molecule. So again, here's a picture of the Krebs cycle, a little more in depth. As you see, out of glycolysis, we get pyruvate. It becomes acetyl-CoA in a more oxidative exercise environment. And again, we can use ketones, we can use the ALCs, and then our fatty acids that can become acetyl-CoA. And then from there, we have our NAD carrying that hydrogen to the electron transport chain. Again, right here, FAD is involved too. Again, like I said, that's another transporter, NAD again, and we get energy out of this cycle. Okay, just going over these energy systems again, all 3 of them. Our ATP PC energy system is going to be high intensity, short duration, immediately using whatever ATP we have available, and then our creatine phosphate. Lactic acid system is again it's just our glycolytic system or glycolysis. There's gonna be more moderate intensity, a little bit longer duration, but not too long. And this can produce a little bit more ATP over a shorter period of time, or no, excuse me, a longer period of time. And then lastly, our aerobic system, right? We just went over this. Long duration, low intensity, lots of ATP. And you can see right here are our energy systems through any given activity. So right away, when we start any activity, we are using our ATP creatine phosphate system because we have it available and it can immediately make energy. We might as well use it. Short term, we'll use our glycolysis because we have those sugars more available. And as we accumulate oxygen and able to use our oxidative system, we will use our aerobic system. And again, just looking at the durations of each of these, our phosphocreatine is 1 to 5 seconds. And as we go along into longer durations, we transition through different energy systems. All right, so looking at maximal oxygen uptake in trained versus untrained men, we can see a difference in how fast they're able to go. This is likely a treadmill. How fast they're able to go and when they peak in their oxygen uptake, which would be your VO2 max. So you can see down in the red, untrained men, they will peak or in this study, they peaked around 10, 11 miles per hour and at 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute of VO2 max. Whereas trained individuals, way later down the line, 17, 18 miles per hour, and they're looking more at a VO2 max of 60. So if we do aerobic endurance training and we increase our aerobic oxidative capacity, we can increase this VO2 max, right? We have more ventilatory efficiency, more capillary density, mitochondrial density, oxidative enzyme activity. Like all those things that contribute to our aerobic performance. If we have more capillaries, we're more efficient at gas exchange. If we have mitochondria, we're more efficient in the Krebs cycle. And then we have this term, this is important to know for the tests. We have our excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or also known as EPOC. And what this is after you work out, you're going to have excess oxygen that's going to be consumed post-workout. So if I do a workout, I'm going to start in an oxygen deficit. My body doesn't have the volume of oxygen it needs to use the aerobic system right away. And like we said, the aerobic system can provide a lot of energy, but it's relatively slow to get started because we need this oxygen there to really use it. So as I exercise, I go here on the chart, I go through more time of exercise, my oxygen consumption is going to increase. And here's what I need to sustain my maximal aerobic capacity. Once we meet that deficit, that lack of oxygen we have, we'll have what's called EPOC, right? Our post-exercise oxygen consumption, like I said. And after that, we have an oxygen debt because we had this deficit early on. It took us a long time to meet it. And to be able to go on after that exercise and recover, we are going to take in oxygen to pay off this oxygen debt. So that's why after we exercise, we don't just immediately turn off our need for oxygen. It's because we didn't have the oxygen we needed to begin with. We're going to continue to take it in at an increased rate after exercise to pay that debt off. So just looking at it again here, we have our oxygen requirement for set activity. Here's our resting consumption, right? We're not taking much oxygen in besides just what we need for our steady state of life, right? We're walking around, chilling on the couch, not much oxygen. We start exercise, we have a requirement, and we have little to no oxygen ready for that, and we have to pay off the deficit. And at the end, once we finish exercise and we recover, or we go through recovery, we continue to take oxygen, as you can see, and it slowly declines once we recover completely. We won't need it, but there will be this period of time which we continue to need oxygen, even though we're not exercising anymore.